Hi, and welcome to Diversity Dignified. I'm Tom Handel, and if you've watched this show before, you'll know that I'm not the regular host of the show. The regular host of this show is Matthew Francis, my guest for this show. Hello. And I am thrilled that Matthew asked me to host this show so that I could talk to him about his new book, My Resurrected Spirit, which just came out, and I had the pleasure of reading it. Now, I've known Matthew about 2 years now. We met, and he told me his experience as a transgender man and was interested in doing a show on this station, which of course was great. And I started to get to know him, and I think we've become pretty good friends. But I did not nearly know enough about him until I read his book, which is just amazing. He's sort of a hero now to me for what he's described in this book that he's gone through. And there's a lot of information, there's a lot of points in this book that I'd like to go over, and I hope we have enough time for it all. But before we get into it, Matthew, I just wanted to ask you, what motivated you to write this story of your life?
Well, Tom, as you know, in the book, and most of my life, I've suffered from a tremendous amount of trauma. The first 18 years were full of trauma. And then I spent an absorbent amount of time trying to overcome that trauma. And I don't think I felt like I was doing that successfully. I had pretty much was just collecting a disability check, and I was in a basement apartment. And I pretty much watched Netflix every day, all day. And I had very few friends. And once I transitioned, I found that I was able to get off medications, and I was able to sort of have a life. And the reason I wrote the book wasn't so much to highlight transgender issues. I think it's for all the people who are still in the basement, who really believe that they don't have a life, or that the most they can aspire to are activities of daily living. And I guess I wanted to show that it's possible to get out from underneath all that. And that was the reason behind it. Well,
if that was the reason behind it, I think it was very successful. Because when I read this book, my first thought was, how could anybody survive all this? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of things that you touch on or go into detail on that are major themes. Mm-hmm. That if a person hasn't, hopefully not a lot of people have experienced all of this, but some people have experienced some of it. There's the issue of child abuse, the issue of poverty, there's the issue of surviving cancer, of going through having mental illness and getting mental health services, of your own spiritual journey, which has been incredible considering what you've been through, mm-hmm. as well on top of it as your own realization and coming out as a transgender man. Mm-hmm. So just to start with, and what was really very, very shocking right from the very beginning mm-hmm. of the book, I mean, the first few pages of the book had me sold. I just went right mm-hmm. through it. Is the physical abuse that you went through as a child. And one of the things that struck me about it is that, I have no idea who your parents are, where you grew up, or anything mm-hmm. about them. I don't think I'd be able to find out about it. How was it to deal with that, to come to terms, to relive some extreme physical abuse, mm-hmm. and then the emotional abuse, your own self-image as a result of it? How did it feel writing all about that?
Okay. Well, initially when I started writing, it was really difficult. In fact, I knew that emotionally I was going to go back into that space, and would find, even as I was writing, the tears just like pouring down my face, and dealing with issues on a deeper level. It was like an onion, right? You're peeling back the layers and the layers. And so I was sort of reliving the physical abuse, I was sort of reliving the emotional abuse, and then I found it just very cathartic to do the writing. Not every story made it in the book. Mm-hmm. And I found it hard, which is why it's a collection of short stories and essays, because I just couldn't find the thread that I was looking for to do it in a congruent way, in a timeline that we all appreciate. because for me, as you know, I moved a lot. And this isn't once a year, it was several times a year, every year. And so I think I live with time being very fluid. And so knowing that, that's how I had to go about writing the book. But I realized as I was writing it too, though, that I had healed so much. So towards the end, I could feel myself getting stronger and stronger, and I was just ready. And I feel like the world is ready because there's so much more awareness about transgender issues. There's so much more awareness about trauma, and I really feel like mental health, mental illness is finally getting, you know, the attention it deserves without all the stigma and the shame. And so I kind of feel like this book is a bit timely because I'm tying in all three. And the one thing I'm doing that I know no one else has done is come out of this generational trauma and mental illness, because I don't know that there's many statistics for a person like me. It would have been conceivable, really, I should be dead, and then if not, really suffering from just a tremendous amount of problems in which I was in the basement, sort of being institutionalized differently.
Mm-hmm. Right,
so,
right.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned to me, and it's in the book too, about the abuse you experienced, the physical abuse experience being ritualistic. Mm-hmm. Could you go into a little bit more detail about that? Because it may be misunderstood about what ritualistic means.
Right, right. Well, back in the 1980s, ritualistic often went hand in hand with the satanic panic, they call it. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks were being diagnosed with multiple personality disorder, and it was a result of satanic abuse or ritual abuse. And what we know now is that the satanic abuse, for most people, did not happen, that was sort of morphed into something, and we're not quite sure how that happened or why. I have some theory that it's easier to blame Satan than it is your uncle or your dad who's abusing you. And we threw the baby out with the bathwater because we really discounted multiple personality disorder. And now we're starting to realize that complex post-traumatic stress and disassociation are very, very much a phenomena of abuse. And we weren't looking into that because if you were rejecting the multiple personality, my hunch is you were rejecting the satanic abuse. You knew that wasn't going on. Now, when I say ritualistic abuse in my book, what I mean is simply I could count on it. I knew I was being abused every day. And in that sense, it was ritualistic.
How did it feel like coming home, knowing?
I would cry. If I was on a bus, I'd be very, very quiet. You couldn't reach me. The kids would try to talk to me. I'd be crying. I'd be pleading with God, I don't want to be beat today. Please don't let them beat me today. And I would be begging. And I couldn't concentrate on anyone else because I was too busy doing my repetitive praying.
So you had this, not only the abuse that you were going through, but you could anticipate it every time. It wasn't like happy-go-lucky and then suddenly it came out of nowhere. No. How did you, and this is what I find really amazing about your book, is how did you develop the capacity to want to love, not to, and then you did say that for a while you were drawn into a shell, but you did develop emotionally some kind of capacity or need for intimacy when all the people around you and the people that were actually abusing were your birth parents.
Right.
How did you develop that capacity to want to have connections with people? I
think that two things. On some level, I must have been wanted enough in my early years or I would have died. I was hospitalized twice for failure to thrive, and best of my knowledge, that was before the age of 4 years old. But I did, as you know, went to live with my meme, and that's a big chapter in the book. And
your grandmother?
My grandmother. Meme is French for grandmother, and it was on my father's side. And she really believed in nurturing you back into health. And so she, spared nothing. I got all kinds of affection and attention and food. And probably I would have been diagnosed, if we had the services back then, with severe childhood depression, because I was very withdrawn, very into myself. And she nurtured me out of that. And to say that I wanted to be connected all the time would be wrong. When I went to live on my own, I realized I wasn't connecting with people properly. I wanted to, but I didn't know how to. And so the desire to be whole is in us. I believe that no matter what has happened to you. And that desire never left me. So I wanted to improve my connections. And sometimes I was successful at that and sometimes not so much. But how that is in me, I just believe it's in all of us, that we do have a desire to really connect, unless there's just something really, really off, obviously.
Right.
Yeah.
But the other part of that, aside from the intimacy, is when you, and what frustrated me about reading the book was the number of adults around you, even at one point where your mother called the Department of Human Services and saying, I'm not doing the right thing here. I need help. And they were saying, oh, if you realize that you're okay, never mind. And I don't think I'm giving anything away in the book by saying that, but the wasn't there some kind of challenge to develop trust in anybody, even your meme, for all the people who had the older people who were supposed to protect you, to let you down?
Yeah, there was, because as a kid, I think most of us think the adults around us can fix things and make it better, and I had no illusions about that. And I had seen good people act poorly, and I had seen too much, too soon. So it was always a challenge to trust people, and it still is, really, to this day, in many ways. I do believe in people's innate goodness, but I know that it's easy to go astray too, so I know that. I think we have a dilemma in our society, because we have all these little things like, like father, like son, like mother, like daughter. I talk about that. And unfortunately, the adults, when bad things are happening, it's not that they don't want to get involved, but we kind of have that mentality that we shouldn't, or it's a family thing, or if your dad is not well regarded in the community, well, probably the kids aren't going to make it into anything either. And we discount people, and we put them in boxes, and then we make it impossible for them to get out of the box. So even when they do, we don't even recognize that it's happened.
Yeah.
And I felt like that had happened to me, because it was like I was sort of the dirty kid that no one wanted to play with, teachers didn't know what to do with me, and they didn't want to get involved. And I understood why, but it was really, or even it was, don't push Annie, she, her father is so-and-so. And you could just see them visibly, oh, you know what I mean? And that was really detrimental. It's a detrimental way to look at the world. It's a detrimental way of treating each other. So I think I'm really passionate about, to me, social activism is to bring other people into the light, so to speak. It's not to box them and then make it impossible to leave.
It's so amazing to me that you keep on coming back to a perspective that's so enlightened, when the people around you at the very early formative stages, not only your parents were physically abusing, but the people around you discounted you because of your parents, rather than saying, well, we should help these kids or this child because they have this situation. And the other thing that is really striking about the book that I thought was amazing in terms of coming through is not just your parents, but the poverty that you had to experience. I mean, I think that there's a lot in this book about how that reflected on your self-esteem.
Well, even just thinking of yourself as poor, it sets a paradigm in your own mind as to what opportunities are accessible to you, who's accessible, what things you're going to get to do, what you're not going to get to do. So in some ways you internalize that and you limit yourself. And I would limit myself because I just thought of myself as a poor person. Poor people don't do that. Poor people don't get to do that. And so I've had to really peel that away too. We are equal by virtue of being unique, but we're not equal in resources, and so let's not pretend that we are. Some of us get born into better family situations than others, and there's a tremendous deficit when you're not even getting your basic needs met. When I'm going to school and all I can think about is stealing from the students their food, I can't think about math and reading, which is going to eventually, in theory, get me beyond this.
And that's much more pervasive than we think.
Right.
There are a lot of children
more
dealing with hunger issues in school than they are dealing with the actual academics.
I'll give you an interesting example, but I was constantly stealing, and I would get in trouble for stealing food. And then one time, in one particular situation, when this was allowed, the teacher was like, is there anyone who doesn't want to eat their lunch? And those of us who wanted the leftovers, we could go get it. Well, I took my tray and I piled. It was piled. And I got in trouble for that. Instead of it being a red flag, what's going on?
Right.
Why is this kid, trying to eat like 10 10 portions of everything. And it seemed like these things were constantly being brought up. I was coming to school always underdressed, not dressed for winter at all, not with winter clothing. I was constantly hungry. One time I was in 5th grade, I refused to sit down because I had been beaten so badly. I was so bruised. And actually I found out years later I had a chipped tailbone. Now, I was a student who never caused problems. I was eager to please, and I would not sit down, and this teacher sent me to the office. I got in trouble, but no one pursued why I wouldn't sit down. So there's things, and I guess I get,
Didn't you even say to them, gee,
sometimes I did, but eventually you just learn that it didn't matter.
Didn't matter to them.
It didn't matter.
No matter what you said.
It didn't matter what I said. So, and then child protection was in and out of our home all the time, and I guess I just didn't think they were very bright, to be honest. Like, did they not know once they left we were getting beaten? Did they not know? I didn't know what to make of it. And you just learn that, no, the adults aren't all powerful.
Yeah, right.
So,
The people,
right.
The people that you trusted. Now, the other part of this that's kind of amazing to me, and I want to touch on, you have in there child abuse, you have the poverty. But from the very beginning, you were introduced to your faith.
Yes.
Through your family.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be a consistent thread throughout. I mean, there were rough patches,
Yep.
but throughout all your experiences, and there's more to come, but you were introduced to your faith through your family, and you held on to your faith. Why?
Well, they didn't introduce it to me initially. My mother would struggle with being an atheist off and on my whole life. And my father just took me to church, in my mind, just a few times. I had, as you know, a supernatural kind of experience that shouldn't have had any basis, because part of the experience was my understanding of the Lord's Prayer. And I was not introduced to it at that point. So I did have some supernatural experiences. If I had to do the book over, that's one thing I would have done a little different, is I only kind of give you 2 or 3 supernatural experiences that I have, as opposed to the nitty-gritty day-to-day love affair with my faith. I got my faith through MASH, the TV program, Father Mulcahy. I pieced it together because at one point I was very much neglected, and I was allowed to do what I wanted, and I found a church that wasn't too far away, and I went to Sunday school. So that is how it happened. It got pieced together in very, snapshots, pockets. And I would just keep praying. Maybe in some ways it was just a desperation, and it wasn't the awareness that I have with God, as you know, I bring that up many times,
Yes.
is he was a judge, and he was angry jailer, and I was the criminal who was always getting it wrong. And I said to God, I don't love you, I'm scared of you. I don't even know how to love anyone, no one's loved me. And I think the only thing that I could say that I could offer, and I tried to offer the reader, why did I bring this up, why did I mention it, is to have a relationship. And it's not always going to be spectacular and supernatural. And it's not always, just be honest though. Just be honest and keep coming back. And that's the only thing I can think of that I did.
In a way, God to you was a relationship that you can maintain.
Yes.
And that's what was bringing you forward. It wasn't necessarily a positive experience at first, but it was a relationship that you could hold on to.
And be honest.
And be honest with.
Yes.
Yeah, because there is a point at which you do mention in the book that you get angry at God.
Yes.
But and of course God is just this power person.
Right.
Who is allowing this to happen to you? So that's sort of the thing. The other I want to get back to the obviously. You're still faithful. You've improved your relationship with God tremendously, but that isn't usually the case with a person who not only goes through all the things that you go through, but also for a transgender person and the conventional thoughts about Christianity. Yeah. But what I think that I do want to get into here is what happened to you when you discovered you had cancer.
Okay.
Could you just talk about that within the boundaries of you're not giving too much away in the book?
Okay. So at this point, my relationship with God is still honest, but I'm still insecure about our love affair, so to speak. And I get diagnosed with cancer. As I am meeting with a beloved friend, she's introduced me to Neil Douglas clots, and she's introduced the Aramaic translation of the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, and it's a very different translation. Well, as we're praying, I was trying to feel my heartbeat, and what I felt was like a walnut-sized lump. And in my heart, I knew right then I had cancer. I just knew. And so, you know, just fast forwarded, I do get the diagnosis of cancer, and I decide that, you know, I'm 42 years old, and life has been nothing but a struggle for me. It's been 18 years of abuse, and then it's been all this time trying to overcome it, and with some success, but mostly not success to my satisfaction. So I decide I'm going to go home to God. I'm ready. You know, I got cancer.
Right.
I am brave and I'm courageous, and no one is going to fault me. I've struggled with suicide. I put a whole chapter on the suicide, how much I struggled with suicide, and now I wasn't going to have to commit suicide. I'm just going to let cancer run its course. And then I, as you know, that changes. There's a social worker who took me under her wing, and I do get the treatment. And then, of course, it was, you know, chemotherapy, 8 hours. And a port put in my chest, and it was surgeries, and it was infections, and it was radiation, and it was 10 months. And so, but what happened in that 10 months is really the cancer community sort of nurtured me into psychological health, in my opinion. And there was no way I was going to go back to the life that wasn't working. And during this time, I had purchased a computer, and I was now on the internet.
When you say cancer community, you're referring to the medical establishment
Both.
or other people?
There's a community center that's beautiful, that offers yoga and classes and support groups. And
That's the Cancer Community Center. It's called the
Cancer Community Center. It's a beautiful, I think that is the template we need to be using. You know, you get cancer, you get a goodie bag and a plethora of resources and an entire community embracing you. You get diagnosed with a mental illness, you're lucky if you can find a psychiatrist and a social worker. You're not certainly embraced as being courageous and brave. So I just really want to point that out. And so I wasn't okay, so during this time, I actually do start researching, and I figure out I'm transgender. And a few things are going through my mind. Obviously, one is still that concept of I've got to take this to the grave. This is the burden I've been given, and this isn't Christian. Really, I was still up to that point, still thinking that.
Yeah.
And then, so you know, I'm burning with. I know I'm transgender. Oh, and I'm 42. What am I going to do about this?
Right, yeah.
And also, there was a lot of guilt that I hadn't told anyone. No one knew this, that I'd kept this such a secret. And so there was a lot of things going on. And then, of course, I have the dark night of the soul, and we'll let the book do that, where I just finally struggle and feel really affirmed that not only is this not a sin, but God made me, and I'm beloved. And that just hit me. And it is not as though I hadn't heard those messages. It just finally made sense.
Well, you were put up against the wall with the cancer. You know, you were given life or death,
and
you had to choose one.
And I chose life, and I was not going to go back to the one that wasn't working. And that was the crux. Am I going to own who I am? And I've earned the right to be who I am, and I'm going to step up to the plate, or I may as well end it right now. You know, what's the point?
And so, you know, what's really amazing to me about this whole experience with cancer and coming to the realization I'm a man, I need to live honestly as a man, happens after you're 40. When you turn 18, you can leave home, but you don't right away, and you're still undergoing abuse. Why? Why didn't you think to get out?
Because I had because in some ways I had replaced. As you know, early on, I realized very early on that neither parent wants me, or my brother as well at the time, that this is about money and they don't want nothing to do with us. And so I replaced my family really with this society's point of view, and I was trying to please society. And society wants cisgendered heterosexual people. And so I internalized their values. And so I didn't need my parents inside of my head, they were in my head. And I didn't need society telling me, because
why did you stay at home when you were 18?
Oh, because I was still being abused. And so I left and I went to live at the Y.
Oh, and you did finally leave when you were 18?
Very shortly
thereafter, because you were still being abused. Okay, so you have this over 20 years between the time that you leave home and then you have this sort of transition that initiates with cancer. What was your life like for those 20 years?
That's a tough one, because the well-meaning mental health psychiatric professionals, what we know now is that the treatment of trauma 20 years ago was not only ineffective, in many ways it was actually abusive. It was about reliving the details over and over again.
Really?
Yes, it was. And it was traumatizing people left and right. And now we know that there are better approaches for that treatment. And also you've got to remember that we started to become very entrenched in the medical model at this point. We're starting to be mental illness is all a medical condition, and we use the example so often of diabetes. Mm-hmm. And we're convinced, and I was told, that you're never going to overcome your mental illness. At best, you're going to manage it. Mm-hmm. So what we know about drugs and alcohol abuse is that if you do it, you kind of stunt your growth emotionally. Well, if you're taking 5 or 6 medications at heavy doses, probably that stunted my growth. And what I also realized is that it impacted my memory, it impacted my ability to carry my thoughts, and it even impacted my IQ. I had been diagnosed with an IQ of 119. The second time I took it, it was 100. The third time I took it, it was 85. And they wanted to take it a 4th time, and everything went flying, because I didn't want to hear that I was stupid.
What do you mean everything went flying?
Because the tester was there and the books were out, and I literally...
Everything you got mad.
I would not do
gosh.
it. No, I wouldn't do it. I wasn't going to have any part of it. And I said, I'll tell you right now, I'll spare you the trouble. I'm borderline retarded. And
how old were you?
At that point, probably late 20s, yeah.
Oh, wow.
But that's how much it had impacted me.
And why were they still, because you were in the mental health
system? Because I wasn't getting better.
Yeah.
I wasn't really getting better. Partly because I didn't really have a community. I was isolated. We still kind of do that. We put people in housing, and there's not enough supports, and so you're just isolated. And so that expression, oh, they're doing it for attention, has some truth to it. People need attention. It's a basic human need.
Right.
And when you're not getting attention, you go a little not well, and then you start acting up, and then you get the attention you need, and then you're fine. So in their mind, you're doing it for attention, but in my mind, and I think in the mind of a lot of other you're doing it because you're not getting the attention, and then when you get the attention, then you're fine. And so I could go periods of time of being okay if I had enough support in my life, but I really wasn't up to snuff with my social skills, so I was really pushing people away.
Well, you had a lot to process.
I did,
even
yes.
Still after you left.
Yes.
You carried that. Now, how did you get into the mental health system? You leave home, and you need to make it on your own.
Well, very quickly, to be honest, because when I left home, within a week, I was having a really interesting experience with my body, feeling what we would call depersonalization or dissociation, but I was experiencing being so disconnected, and it turns out I just wasn't in pain, and I didn't know what that felt like. I had no idea what that felt like. And all of a sudden, I started to smash myself up against walls, and then I was okay, because that was familiar, to feel pain. And I'd be okay. I could be okay. It wasn't...
Did I miss that in the book? Was that in
the book?
No,
there's some things I felt I'm being too vulnerable, but I'm even that has been so healing that I can talk about things that I wasn't ready to discuss in the book. But I never was a person who cuts. I know there are some folks who do a lot of cutting, and that might have a similar thing, but for me it was because I was used to being thrown and beaten. So cutting, I did experiment only one time, and it didn't do for me what it does me. Right, so I needed
like
to...
the kind of abuse you had. Wow, I just didn't really realize that happened, that you were feeling more comfortable with yourself after you did, you repeated what was so traumatic for you in your childhood. Wow.
And I believe we know now that trauma stifles you. Mm-hmm. And then I believe that all the being so heavily medicated, and I say this with trepidation because there are folks who need medication, and I don't want to advocate, go off your meds willy-nilly style. But when you're on a heavy-duty amount that I was on, it might be worth taking a look at.
Yeah.
So I believe it was psychically keeping me stuck. And I would even think, I'm like, I keep doing the same things. I'm just not very bright. And it turns out, in my mind, it was the meds keeping me from learning properly, and to be even to be able to hold the example long enough to grow from it.
How did that? Because your book is written very much, I would say, in a mosaic style.
Yes.
Even though there's some linearity to it in terms of what happens, it goes back and forth.
Yes.
At sometimes between different points, and it really. it really centers on some of your major points and what you lived through. But when you that final stage, and what amazed me is that, like, if I were 18 and I were living up the way you did, that you didn't leave immediately on the 18th birthday. It took you more time to you know, like, feel that abuse and then get out.
Yeah.
How did you make a living? Where did you live? And how did you get introduced into the mental health system?
Okay. So I immediately came to, at the time it was the Y in Portland, YWCA, and that was on Spring Street. And it was very difficult because I was still in high school. And so I was getting rides from a teacher to get to school, rides back, and I was still working at the time. It was Zayres, if you remember.
Oh yeah, I used to work at Zayres.
Now it's Ames and whatever, and I was working at Zayres. And then eventually I just wanted to finish school because there's that whole chapter of the, you know, the principal wanting everyone to quit who wasn't worthy of graduating.
That was an amazing chapter, but
yeah,
go on.
So I'm at Zayres, and then I decide, you know, the resources were better then, to be honest. It's that simple. So I went to the city, and they would help me with the rent and some food.
Okay.
And so what happened, a couple things happened very quickly. I started Menses for the first time. I'm 18,
Whoa.
which is very late. I grow, my breasts start to develop. I gained 30 pounds within about 2 months. And I didn't look overweight, I looked normal. So a lot of transformation. I didn't know how to eat properly, so when I would buy my food, it would be gone within 2 or 3 days, and I'd have to go hungry. But then everybody at the community was really sweet, and they'd feed me. And I don't know.
This is from the YWCA?
Yeah, and I don't know that it's an eating disorder, sort of the stereotypical eating disorders, but I was so used to not eating and always being hungry that I would eat so fast. And I had to learn to slow down. I had to really learn how to do that. And that took a long time.
And so you were introduced into the mental health system through this community of support that you found at the YWCA.
Part of what happened, it happened at the Y. It was during one of my beating myself, when I was smashing myself up against the walls. People heard and were very concerned, and then the social worker that was there called the police. And then once you get tagged, it can be hard to throw that. And so the history, I'm in that category of people who are severe and persistent mental illness. And I'm just gonna share you the suspense. That basically means you're hopeless. And if you're in that category, this isn't, gee, I have a little general anxiety. This is, you're struggling. And I talk a bit about OCD, having OCD. Right. And that was a tremendous, when I look back at that time in my life when it was definitely at its peak, I don't know how I functioned. I was just involved in prayer and ritual, all sorts of ritual, and I would no sooner be done than I'd have to do it again. And so
prayer and ritual, what do you mean?
Because I was evil and dirty. So I would pretend to wash myself. If I couldn't physically wash myself, I would pretend to wash myself. And then I would recite the Lord's Prayer, and then I would recite the Hail Mary, and then I would have to do it a certain amount of times in a certain way. And this was hours. And then I was done, but I messed up on the third prayer. I'd have to do it all over again.
I see. Yeah, and this was after you started receiving mental health services?
Oh, I've been doing this. I would say of all the mental health issues I struggle with, OCD would be the most difficult, and I would say that I've managed, but I still struggle with it still, yes.
Okay.
If you catch me doing some of this, it usually, that's my little ritual, like get the filth off. Or if I've been in someone's energy that feels negative to me, I kind of like get it off.
Hey, well, maybe that's a good, maybe that's a good mental image for you to go through doing, and it actually succeeds. But when you went into the mental health system after you finding this community of support, it sounds like it undid you in a way. It did some progress, even though it.
Yeah, because it's a systematic issue. There were good people who do this work. There are good people who are peer workers. There are good people who are therapists and psychiatrists. But we've got insurance companies and we got medicine models that are really overtaken common sense. And you can only do so much in a limiting system. So the system was not useful to me, but people were. And those relationships made the difference. How do you quantify the integrity of a relationship? And I can't do that for you. All I can say is that there were good people put in my path. In fact, there's one right now doing the cameras. And those things help fortify me and they help each other. But the system is broken. and we need to fix it. We need a holistic approach. When we talk about community inclusion, that does not mean an apartment complex where you isolate everyone. We need to look at what really saves money. How about people's potential? How about people's quality of life? Those things matter. We're making this all about, dollars. And really, think about how much money I'm actually saving in the mental health profession, because I'm not in the emergency room anymore. I'm not taking medications. I really wish they'd pay for my massages and my acupuncture. So.
Did you feel like you had to escape the mental health
Well,
system
yeah,
in a
and
way?
you said that I was tagged as an adult, but actually I want to point out that's not true, because I was tagged even as a young person. I was tagged with infantile autism. So I was diagnosed as a young person, and as you know, Child Protective often made me do mandatory counseling. So I was actually in the mental health system quite way before I became an adult.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. And so you went into therapy and went into counseling,
Yes.
and nobody said this guy this girl
Yeah.
needs to be out from they're getting abused regularly.
Oh, they did take us out of the home. I was
Okay.
taken out of the home, but reunification is the goal, and it should be the goal. And I think that that's where we would need to look at some of the things going on with my mom that are not necessarily all her fault. There's poverty. There were women's issues. I was raised in the 70s and 80s. We don't have the same awareness. There wasn't the same resources for her. So I'm not excusing my mother by any stretch of the imagination, but it has to look at her with the historical context of how these things were unfolding. And I think to my credit, give her some kudos, because she did. I'll never forget, we're being abused, and she becomes really despondent that she's doing this. And she picks up the phone and she basically turns herself in. And they pretty much say, well, if you know you're abusive, then you're okay.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That's amazing,
That was the
right?
one of the most frustrating parts about the book.
And then she has tried at times to get help. And yet she's limited too, because she can't really say how bad it's getting, because then you're talking about criminal charges. So
right,
she
right.
kind of would own up to a certain amount and then back off. And I have a lot of compassion, but there's no taking away that there needs to be some accountability. And then there were people trying to help her, and if she's not being honest with them, they can only do so much. So.
Yeah, right. So, when you finally, going through all of this, you faced after the cancer, the transgender
Yes.
issue.
Yes.
But in the book, it goes like the mental health service goes all the way back to your childhood. You knew you had a friend that you identified. You both had this identity, and you knew it, but you couldn't share it with anybody else because you'd get beaten up.
Right.
How did that carry through? How do you keep it? Was it all because you felt it was wrong?
I did, as you know, I thought it was wrong. I love the sinner, hate the sin. And then, of course, to me it was complicated, because the sin is the sinner in this case, right? I am transgender. How do you cut that out? I guess I have to refer to the Bible, and I just look at Jesus's teachings, which are about love. It's about not being judgmental. And quite frankly, I've done a tremendous amount of research. Please, if you're listening to this, viewers, there is a diversity in nature. There are trans animals. There are trans everywhere, and the same with sexuality. Diversity is just everywhere, and I guess I've concluded that if God didn't like it, then why did he make so much of it? And that's basically how I want to leave that for that, yeah.
Well, but going back to the spiritual part of that whole process, you mentioned that you did get angry at God and that sort of thing, but you had this, you mentioned about miracles happening in your life, and it is sort of like when you're reading the book, they're not as prominent in your mind because you figure, okay, this person has a right to experience these things or think they're experiencing these things, because all the reality and the hardships that you went through would allow for some, escapism, way to escape. But you also mentioned, just as we're talking now, about your understanding or your of the actual translation or the genuine words of the Our Father. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I'd love
and
to.
why that meant so much to you?
Yes, because the Our Father, as we know it, is a very beautiful prayer. But even just the first word, Our Father, which is translated Abun de Bashmaya, it actually means creator, birther, mother, father, universe, shimmering light, shimmering sound. Wow, that's much more inclusive. and it proceeds. I could do the whole thing for you right now, and I'll spare you all. But it all does, and it gets much more inclusive. And then to understand the teachings of the New Testament, Christ's parables, Christ's miracles, one has to understand the history and the culture. Well, I started doing some digging, and he really was quite radical, quite a revolutionary. And I guess it hit me that he talks about people being loved and to dealing with people with compassion. And he's always for the underdog. He's always for the other.
Right.
Whoever
right,
that
exactly.
other, the tax collectors, the Pharisees, he's for the
prostitutes.
other, the prostitutes, not even the politically correct others.
Right,
he's
right.
right with all of them. And then it hit me, maybe being beloved was for everyone, including Matthew. Maybe being loved and being of infinite worth is also for me. And so it started within. And I had to start thinking, like, maybe that's true for me too. Well, why don't I just pretend it's true for an hour for me? What would that look like? How would I sit? And I'd find I'm sitting a little straighter. And I would find that I'm coming to the table with a little bit more pride. Not ego, but pride. And then it would hit me, I was able to be more generous with other people around me because I was starting to experience it for the first time within myself.
So what you're saying actually is that your salvation, with all this abuse that happened outside of you, or these circumstances that comes from outside, came from within. That's what you're finding in your spiritual journey.
Yes.
Did that happen on its own? Did anybody introduce you to that idea?
No, I think that these truths are in our DNA. And if we can just sit long enough and be willing to sift through these things, I think we'll get there. I don't think you ever have to read any kind of holy book. Mm-hmm. I think it's innate.
Oh wow, and that's huge, because that's a whole part of a transformation. And I think that a lot of the people that look for a transformation in themselves in their life don't know to look inside, but that look for something outside. And obviously, traditional Christian religion, and probably traditional other religions, or religions that really put an emphasis on the trappings of their religion rather than the spiritual center of it, get lost in all those trappings.
Yes.
You have not, though, like other people in your similar sort of situation, or one of the similar situations, have not rejected your traditional religion, your Christianity. How do you practice? Do you find a community to practice with?
Yes, it's very important to have the community. For me, sometimes when I approach God, it is with deep reverence. The house has to be spotless. I've showered and I've got on my best attire, and the candles are lit. It's reverent and awe. And then other times it's as though we're just having a conversation, just like now, no different. And for me, that works. And as far as the moment, a community where I'm going every single week, that's not happening, because I do feel called at the moment to go about different places. I'm even going to a synagogue right now. I've gone a few times. So I feel very called, but I feel like I make friends along the way, and so they are my spiritual communities, even if I'm not going there every week.
Right.
So yes, so I do have, and I have several friends that some are Jewish friends and some are Christian friends and some are atheists, but yet we have this drive to be better people and to try to practice a wholesome love, an intentional love. And that's my community. So not a specific church.
Okay,
Yeah.
But you do practice on your own and also.
Oh, every morning, 5 a.m. we have an appointment.
So 5 a.m. What is that like?
It's good morning. It's good morning. I feel I've actually been a little more flexible with it. So now it's sort of good morning. I want to give my first fruits, and then I kind of go back to bed, and then I go back and that's just between me and God. But yeah, there might be some candles that get lit, and some prayers that are maybe more systematic, and then prayers of my heart.
So your whole experience with your community, your religious community, you see as expansive. It's
it's everybody. See, what we know, all faiths say this, that we're all interconnected. Well, science is completely backing this up now.
Right.
Now we know there's no ambiguity. So I don't care if you're an atheist or Muslim or Hindu or Christian. All of these are umbrella terms. Buddhists, all umbrella terms. We are all interconnected. So really, when we other somebody, when we degrade lives, any life, We're degrading ourselves collectively. Who knows, maybe that person that is holed up in their basement apartment has got the cure for cancer if we can just nurture them out. And I do believe in nurturing people into health, and I'll tell you why, because of my Christian faith. Jesus to me is such a gentleman. He knocks, he waits to be invited. He doesn't kick the door in, he doesn't build walls. He waits to be invited. So expecting, a change of heart it's a reciprocal process.
Now let's talk about your other community, because you're transgender, and there is a community of transgender.
Yes.
And intuitively, maybe for better or for worse, or whether or not it's true, you think the transgender community would reject religion. How do you deal with your religion in that community?
Okay, so sometimes rejection or anything is a knee-jerk reaction. Anyone can have a reaction, Tom. That's a biological, something turns you off, someone hurt you, you have a reaction, big deal. Anyone can do that. For me, it's about going beyond surviving. It's about thriving and flourishing. So my reaction, why would someone who's bad to me, who claims to be a Christian, represent Christ? He doesn't they're behaving poorly in that moment.
Right.
Okay, and I behave poorly, I share that, right? And how can I be like, how dare you compare me to these people? And I say it right there, I did a disservice to Christianity in that moment.
The other part that seems to be a big emphasis on your show is the safety issues faced by people who are transgender.
Yes.
And you had to make a deliberate effort to join that community,
yes,
where your safety would be even more
compromised,
having come from a history
yes,
of that. How did you ever find the courage to do that? You know what it's like to be abused,
yes,
and yet you're walking into an environment now, a society that doesn't accept the decision you've made about yourself.
I think it's remarkable because people have been abused, like I have anyways, have a 33% likelihood of being re-traumatized. That's almost a given.
Whoa.
And then trans people have about an 87% chance of being traumatized. 1 in 10 trans folks are going to die by being beaten to death. That's the facts. So I guess I have an amazing amount of courage, is some of it. But safety is a huge issue for me, not just for me, but whenever I have someone on my show, that's what I'm thinking about. I have to be honest. And I've had some trans people say, I wish you do-gooders would just knock it off. I want to live my life. I'm sick of this awareness. You've made it harder. And there was a couple of times I literally thought about shutting the program down. Like, was I doing more harm than good? But no one that I've interviewed thus far has had any regrets. I check up on them fairly regularly. In fact, they felt it's been a beneficial experience, and I get so many people. I mean, I can be in Walmart. I know, oh my God, I know you from the show. Oh my, that's really helped me. And so I feel like, I can't control everything, obviously, and so that I'm hoping it's doing more good than not.
Yeah.
And that's why I continue.
Yeah, and was the major impetus of it the safety issue?
Yes.
Or it was
because I was thinking in my mind that if we can just normalize this quickly, if I can introduce people, the audience, to just everyday people. We're just everyday people who more or less want the same things as everyone else. We just do gender a little bit differently. Is it really that big a deal? And that was my thought, was we're just gonna normalize this until you see so much about it, it's not that big a deal anymore. And that was my thinking, then that would make it safer. But I don't know that it has, because this awareness has not translated to acceptance, and the last 3 years keep getting worse and worse and worse. So.
Well, the thing that's kind of, I keep on coming back to, and I just want, because I started off saying this, is that, your capacity to want to reach out. And I think what you started off saying was that, hey, you were in a basement, you were sheltered, you were keeping yourself in prison, and you're starting to write about your experiences slowly was the therapy that's sort of caught on. But what, and you say it's innately in all of us to want to connect with people, and that did it. How much did your faith or your connection with any particular individuals, and there's a few I think you mentioned in your book, help you to really say, I'm going to take all these experiences and make myself a stronger person? Because through all of this book, throughout the book, you're constantly mentioning how you put yourself down. So how did you raise yourself above your own putting yourself down?
I always had this drive to want to be normal. That was always something, but I have decided that we are not what experiences have done to us. People can do, you could flip right out on me right now and beat me up. That's not an indication of who I am. But what I'm going to do about it, that's who I am. Am I just going to have a reaction to Tom who just is acting maniacal? Or am I gonna redeem this?
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And so that's what I've decided. What defines me is what I've chosen to do with what's been done to me.
Yes.
And that's how I've reframed it.
And you mentioned a few people in the book. There's your meme, and then there's again a person that you named Jackie, which I understand isn't the
Not
actual
the
name.
actual person. Yeah.
That have like introduced you to this concept of love and intimacy and closeness. How important or significant were they overall in shaping you?
Very important, because I would just hold on to every little scrap of love I got, every little bit of acceptance I got. And you know, you can go back in time and replay the negative things. Well, I also go back and I replay the positives. So I would replay these people, and they'd become, in some ways, larger than life, I suppose. But you know, that's what, that again is my choice, right? I can choose to go back to the negative, or I can choose to say, gee, wow, wasn't I lucky I had this person for this amount of time in my life? Or,
yeah, because the same experience with your meme, even though you talked about it a lot as helping you, it was a short period in your life, and then you never saw her again.
No.
You were just taken out of that environment. Yeah. So I guess that speaks to the fact that when somebody shows love to somebody,
it makes a difference.
You never know how much of a monumental difference it makes in their life, how much it changes them over. And now I realize that she's no longer with us. She's passed away, and you made Jackie a different name than you. Throughout the book, there's no way that anybody reading this book would be able to identify anybody in it.
That's for legal reasons too.
Well, yeah. So how does it? I just want to ask you about the whole overall experience of writing this book, and how it and what you thought about, practically speaking, would happen to your environment and the people around you who would know the people you're talking about, or anything like that, or how it would affect your life, how this being out there, and you know, it's just come out, so it hasn't maybe had the ramifications. How do you feel about, if it did, lots of people read it and became big, the ramifications it would be to you for those people?
Well, legally, I did my homework. So I made sure to disguise, you know, physical identities. And even in the way that I write, if you notice, I just described the action and not too much about like what maybe they were thinking or why they were doing it. So there's some ways when you are writing that kind of, you have to be careful. If the book is to be big, then there is the chance that my physical, biological parents will read it. And but you know what? I'm glad, because they're not dead. And if they would want to approach me, I would be okay. There's no one in this book, there's nothing anyone has ever done to me that I won't have a conversation with you. It might have to be with parameters, but I would have a conversation with anyone who wants to have a conversation with me. And I'm not going to wait for my parents to die before I write this book. Then they can't step up to the plate and say, well, you know, he's full of crap.
Right.
So they have that. They can, right. If they want to step up and take ownership, that's fine. I took great pains to make sure it was honest in terms of what my memory is of experiences that happened. And quite frankly, I feel I was being generous. So that's all I want to say.
Well, I'd say you were extremely generous, even in this interview now with your parents, given what I read. What is your relationship like?
I have not seen my biological parent since the age of 12, and in courtroom, I had to testify.
So your biological parents, but you still live with your mother when you were 18?
Yeah, just a second. Yeah. I met my dad.
Okay.
I haven't seen him, but in a courtroom. And in fairness, we did not win the case, but the judge was so disgusted with the outcome, the jury outcome, that he said he doesn't know how the jury came to this conclusion, but he is forbidding any contact. And at 18, should I want it, or a brother of mine want contact, we could pursue it. Never have. And as for my mother, I left home at 18, but there have been a few pockets of when we had a connection. And one time it was just very abusive, and then the second time was when I had cancer. And she didn't do anything abusive. She just wasn't able to be there emotionally. And so I decided I was going to put it, you know, on the shelf, and I would address it later. And then I transitioned and I realized I don't know how to address this.
Yeah. Well, now talk about the trial. You give me a little bit more information about what, there was a jury trial involving
Yes.
your dad. What was that about?
For very isolated aspects of abuse that were inflicted on me and
So he really did get,
he did go, yes, but
and they found him not guilty?
Yes, but there was only allowed to be talked about 2 separate incidents and not a lifetime. Court things are very complicated, Tom.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
you know, you could do something 100 times, but if you can only prove 1 or 2 things, you can only talk about 1 or 2 things. Also, he got a very good lawyer, so. Also, the lawyer complicated the issue by saying, rightly so, these children have been abused by numerous people, numerous caretakers, and pointed out that we were being currently abused by my mom, and that was true because DHS was involved. You know, how could we be credible to say who did what? And so it got convoluted.
So your credibility, even as an abused child, even though there was...
I was like 14 years old and I looked like 10, and they treated me, when they say you get re-abused in a courtroom, I assure you that's true. Because anyone looking at me should have felt sorry for me. I looked like a little scared kid, not a 14-year-old. And yet I was being treated like I was making this all up, and you know, it was really horrible. And then towards the end, I mean, he had to stop being that relentless because it just looked really bad, you know. But then he did interject, like, look, these kids have just been so abused, and they're currently being abused, and
when you say he, you mean the lawyer?
The lawyer, yeah, yeah.
And you listened to that argument. You had to be there for that argument,
yeah.
even though you were underage and being told that. Wow.
Yeah. But the judge saved my life, in my opinion. So he saved my life, and
Yeah, and then there's a lot in this book that's stirring, but that wasn't even.
No, like I said, not everything I wrote made it. Partly because if I wrote and it was still too fresh or something, I didn't want to put it in to be too vulnerable.
Yeah.
And now I could probably do a revised, updated version and make that a 200-page book, because I do have so many stories that I didn't put in.
Yeah. Well, now that you have your TV show, and it was originally Gender Dignity, and you want to expand it a little bit.
Yeah.
That's why we changed it to Diversity Dignified, and look at more aspects of what you've done. You've written 1 book. And Gender Dignity is pretty much, you know, you're looking at transgender people.
Yes.
That's your focus right now. What's your mission now? What do you see your future for? How do you see you going on, and you know, what the work that you have left to do?
Well, with Diversity Dignified, I open it up so it could be the whole LGBT community, not just trans issues. And then diversity, period. So I decided, well, I could interview anyone I want about anything.
Yeah.
Because one of my missions is to show that we're not all that different. We're much more alike than we are different, and that we're separating ourselves unnecessarily. And so that's the mission behind the show, is that I'm going to really, I think, highlight our similarities. And I also want to address multiple topics. As you know, I addressed addictions and aging and different things, and I want to continue to address those things, but there's some other topics I also, particularly with mental health, because that's really my passion. Trauma and trauma-related mental illness is my passion.
Yeah, yeah. So we're coming to wrap up here, but you talked about what your mission is for your show, but what do you see in life? What do you see the big thing that you see the rest of your life? Now, you've conquered so many things.
Yeah.
What do you see that you're going to really...
Well, I'm going to be going away for a work-study retreat and really working and fine-tuning my workshops, my revolutionary resilience workshops. And I'm also going to get the opportunity to try them out on people.
Yeah.
I also feel I have 5 books in me. So I got 4 more to go.
Great.
And one of them is going to be a workbook. So,
all right.
Yes.
Well, great. Well, we've talked like this before, and we've gone on for hours, and we certainly could go on for hours, but the time is up right now. But I do want to mention again that this book is now available on Amazon.
It's available on Amazon, and I always bring some with me when I do some speaking gigs, which you can always find on my website.
Which is what?
It's hmatthewfrancis.com.
H. Matthew
Francis, 2 T's, CIS. And I have my list of events, and so I try to keep it pretty current as to what's open to the public and then what's maybe private and not open to the public.
Well, I can justify promoting this book because it's promoting one of our shows.
Right,
we don't
right,
usually
right.
do that. And I do have some in my office that you've given me that
Yes.
I can sell. So
Yes.
I make that available too. Well, thank you for asking me to be hosting your
Thank you,
show.
Tom.
I
This is
appreciate it so
awesome.
much.
Thank you.
And for those of you that maybe are watching this for the first time, please tune in again when Matthew again will be the host for Gender Dignity. But for right now, thank you for joining us, and bye.